This is a 2019 Suzuki Swift Boosterjet. Yes, that is the actual name, and it's cool. It's a fun, sporty, practical, exciting hatchback that isn't available in the United States. But today I've borrowed this Swift Boosterjet from a viewer in Mexico, and I'm going to review it. I'm going to start with a little background. Now, Suzuki began selling cars in the United States in the 1980s, and their cars were mostly tiny little economy cars and SUVs that were not really all that great. People only ever bought them because they were cheap. Now, the US car market is a difficult one. There are tons of regulations, it's very competitive, and the US is a huge country, which makes logistics difficult. And in the 2010s, Suzuki decided they didn't want to deal with it anymore, and they left the US market after 2013. Unfortunately, since then, Suzuki has had a bit of a product renaissance. The new Vitara seems to be an excellent SUV, way better than any Vitara Suzuki ever sold here in the United States. The new Jimny is really cool, one of the hottest cars in the markets where it's sold. And then there's the new Swift, which also is far better than any previous Swift Suzuki ever offered us in the US. Fortunately, Suzuki does still sell their cars in Mexico, and so here I am, just yards from the Mexico border, to review this one. Like I mentioned, this is a Swift Boosterjet. It's a sporty version of the new Swift, and Boosterjet is what Suzuki calls the engine. It's a turbocharged 3-cylinder that makes about 110 horsepower and around 125 pound-feet of torque. Now, those may not sound like huge numbers, but this isn't exactly a huge car. It's about as long as a 2-door Mini Cooper, and it weighs only around 2,100 pounds, which is Lotus Elise territory. And today I'm going to review it. First, I'm going to take you on a tour of the new Swift, and I'm going to show you all of its interesting quirks and features. Then I'm going to get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'm going to give it a Doug score. And for more of my thoughts on the new Swift, click the link below to visit autotrader.com/oversteer, where I've also rounded up a list of the coolest cars currently listed for sale on AutoTrader from orphan brands that don't exist anymore in America. All right, I'm going to start the quirks and features of the Swift Boosterjet with one of my very favorite quirks I have seen in any car this year, and that would be the languages in the infotainment system. All right, you go into the infotainment system and you can choose the language. That's pretty common. You have 5 options, and you can see they are British English, Australian English, Indian English, Spanish, or what I think is Thai. Those are your 5 options. 3 of them are English, and 1 of them is Indian English. What exactly is Indian English? Is there a totally different dialect of English in India? I was curious to find out, so I played with all the different languages, went through the infotainment screen, and nothing seemed to change until I went to the voice control. I set it for British English, press the voice control, and this happens.
Please say a command. Ending speech recognition. Please say a command.
Okay, so the woman speaking to you has a pretty strong British accent. So then I set it to Australian English, pressed voice control, and this happens.
Please say a command. You can say phone, navigation, or media. You can also say commands like call, followed by a number or name.
And you can tell her accent has changed. Now she is speaking Australian English. Then I set it to Indian English, and this happens.
Please say a command. You can say phone, navigation, or media. You can also say commands like call, followed by a number or name, address followed by an address, or play followed by an artist or album name.
So in other words, when you select the language in the infotainment system, the differences in English have nothing to do with the words that come out. It's just the accent of the woman who talks to you in the voice controls. And if you choose Indian English, she will have an accent from India. She says the same thing as the British woman, but she sounds Indian, which I just think is hilarious. And by the way, another hilarious thing about those languages is the ones they've chosen. American English, no. Even though this car was sold new like 4 miles from the American border, Indian English is an option instead of American English. Japanese, no. This car is made by a Japanese company in Japan, but instead they give you time. I guess that shows where the priorities are for Suzuki when selling this car. And next up, I want to talk about that infotainment system beyond just the language situation. Specifically, this is a fantastic infotainment system considering what this car cost. The owner told me he paid the equivalent of $12,500 US. The starting price is around $13,000 US in Mexico. And this thing is incredible. Very responsive to your touch, very good. It has Apple CarPlay, it has Android Auto, it has navigation in there in a $13,000 new car. That is a really, really impressive infotainment system. The best I've ever seen given the price point. But with that said, there are some rather interesting quirks of the infotainment system, starting with the volume control. You can see it is a slider. It's over on the left. You slide your finger and then the stereo volume goes up or down. Now, this works better than any other volume slider I've ever used, but obviously most people would rather just have a knob. It simply is easier. Nonetheless, this infotainment system has a slider. And here's another interesting quirk of the infotainment system. You go into settings and there is a setting you can configure called lock keypad while driving. Now here in the States, a lot of automakers will lock you out from the keypad while you're driving for liability reasons. They don't want to get sued. But in this thing, it's your own choice. If you don't want to be able to use it while you're driving, you can turn that on or turn it off, and then you can use it while driving. I guess Suzuki has less lawsuit fears selling this in Mexico. And next up, here is an absolutely classic quirk of this infotainment system. If you look at the screen in between the gauges, you can see the time, 11:19. But if you look over at the infotainment screen, you can see the time, 11:20. You go back and forth and you see they are actually different times, which is rather odd, and that could be rather vexing if you just want the time in your car to match up. Now, the issue here is that the time in the infotainment screen and the time in the gauge screen are actually set separately. To set the one in the gauge screen, there's a little lever you can scroll down to a screen and set the time. To set the one in the infotainment screen, you go into settings, clock, and then you set the time, and they have no relation to each other. So you could easily have the infotainment system and the gauge cluster screen displaying entirely different times. Like the owner told me, this is what happens when you have two different sets of engineers working on a project. Well, we solved this and you can adjust the time. Well, we did the same thing for the infotainment system. And this is the result. And next up, speaking of the gauges and that gauge cluster screen, the screen itself is kind of outdated, black and white, pretty simple, but the gauges themselves look really, really nice. Again, reminded that this is a $13,000 car. Those are the nicest gauges ever installed in a $13,000 car. They just look really, really good, far beyond the price point that this car is actually at. And speaking of the gauge cluster, one other interesting item in that gauge cluster screen, if you go through the settings, one of the settings you can choose is anti-theft. And if you click on that, you can choose between two modes, mode D or mode A. Which one do you choose? Tough call. Do I want D or do I want A? Yeah, I have no idea what they are. Now, next up, the rest of the interior of this car, specifically in the front, is really, really straightforward. There is absolutely nothing unusual or weird or quirky or strange in here. It's all just pretty simple. The only slightly interesting thing I found is in the middle with the climate controls. You can see there are three circles. The circle on the left adjusts the fan speed. You adjust that and you get more or less air. The one on the right adjusts the temperature. You turn that and the temperature changes. The interesting part is the one in the middle looks like it adjusts something, but it doesn't. It's actually just the display screen, and it's purely there for style and symmetry to look like the other two. So you go to adjust the fan speed or the temperature by turning that center dial, and you'll quickly find you're wrong and it doesn't actually do anything. One other interesting item in the front seat area is this car is quite practical. It has a USB auxiliary, it has a 12-volt power outlet, and it also has quite a few cup holders, two in the center and then two in the door pockets for water bottles. So there are 4 total cup holders in the front seats of this car. Again, otherwise pretty straightforward, pretty practical. And next up we move on to the owner's manual in the Swift, where there are a couple of interesting items, starting with the rather ridiculous cartoonish drawings that are in here. You can see this one, for example, looks like a drawing from a Calvin and Hobbes cartoon of like an 80s generic hatchback, which I think is kind of funny. If you look at this one, you can see this guy is stuck. But if you look closer, you can see he's right-hand drive. Now, this car is especially really, really popular in India and in Thailand, which are two right-hand drive countries. Obviously, in Mexico, they're left-hand drive, but they didn't bother to change this little cartoonish drawing, so this man is stuck in right-hand drive. And if you go further in the owner's manual, here's a rather cartoonish drawing of a woman washing her car. She seems pretty happy. And again, you can see she's right-hand drive like Japan, India, Thailand. One other thing I like about this drawing, this car looks like a Suzuki Alto from like the late 80s or early 90s. I wouldn't be surprised if that drawing has made its way into Suzuki owner's manuals for the last 20 years. But hey, why not? It still works, and it looks pretty reasonable to me. My favorite quirk of the Swift owner's manual, however, has to be, I was turning through it and I noticed there are these pages with big black boxes. Now, you look up in the corner and the owner tells me this says template for halogen headlights. Either they didn't print it in here or this car has a different type of headlight. And so instead you just get these black boxes, A, B, C, and D, on these 4 pages. I guess it's where that information is supposed to be if the car was equipped with whatever feature they're going to be describing there. And next we move under the hood in the Swift, where you have the privilege of checking out the engine. Like I mentioned, a 1-liter turbocharged 3-cylinder. It's actually 998 cc's, about 110 horsepower and about 125 pound-feet of torque. As you can see, it is a really, really small engine. Obviously, it's a 1-liter 3-cylinder, but it's really small. This is a small car and the engine is small within it. But my favorite part about the engine simply has to be the fact that the engine cover says on it, Boosterjet. I've been making fun of that, but I really think that is one of the great names for an engine in the car industry today. Every car company wants to brand their engines, and Boosterjet is the best one yet. Way better than EcoBoost or Multi-Air. Suzuki did a great thing when they came out with Boosterjet. And next up we move on to the rest of the Swift, and I have to say from the outside I really like the way the Swift looks. So many hatchbacks today are just boring. They're simple, they're dull, they don't look all that cool. And then when automakers try not to be boring, they often end up with ugly. But the Swift is neither of those things. It has a very distinctive look to it, and yet it isn't ugly. It's a nice look. It's a good looking hatchback. I think one of the best looking hatchbacks on the market today. One detail that I especially like is that the A-pillar next to the front windshield is painted black, and then when you come around to the back of the Swift, you have this black panel back here as well. That gives the roof sort of a floating look. Now, this has become a real trend among luxury cars and SUVs, but you don't often see it in tiny little cheap compact cars, but this one has it, and it's kind of a nice luxurious looking touch. The other thing I like in terms of the Swift's exterior styling is this little black panel back here also integrates the rear door handle. So when you look at the Swift just at a quick glance, you only see 2 door handles in the front, and you're thinking, did Suzuki really cheap out so much that they didn't give the rear doors door handles? No, actually it's quite the opposite. They made it more stylish by integrating those rear door handles kind of near the top of the door, and that sort of cleans up the look in the back of the car. I think it looks pretty good. And next up, climbing into the back of the Swift, some pros and cons back here. The biggest pro is undoubtedly headroom. If you take a look, when I sit up all the way straight, my head is still not touching the ceiling of this car, and that's because of that flat roof design. To make that floating roof look cool, you want to make it flat like a Range Rover or something, and by doing that, it keeps the roof high even in the back, and that allows for more rear headroom than hatchbacks that like taper off in the back. Now, the drawback though is legroom. I have the front seat position exactly where I would sit, and as you can see, my knees kind of push right into the back of the front seat. Obviously, this isn't a huge car. Like I said, about the size of a 2-door Mini Cooper, so it's kind of nice that I fit at all, but it wouldn't be incredibly comfortable for a long trip. And next up, a couple of other interesting items back here. One is the pattern on the rear seats. Take a look at this pattern. If you've watched a lot of my videos, you will remember that pattern from the Lamborghini Aventador. It is the exact same design they use in the Aventador's brake lights, and then it's also used in several other places in the interior of the Aventador. This exact same pattern. It's almost like Suzuki wanted to try to replicate the Aventador in some way, and they chose the rear seat fabric. Another interesting item back here is the fact that once again, it's pretty practical. You have a cup holder in the middle between the 2 front seats in the back of the front center console, and then you also have a cup holder in each door pocket, so you have 3 cup holders for the back. Add that to the 4 up front, and this car has 7 cup holders for 5 seats, which is a nice practical touch. And one other interesting item back here is the fact that on the back of the front passenger seat, you have a little cargo pocket for sticking papers. On the back of the driver's seat, you do not. Suzuki probably saved 91 cents per car by including only 1 cargo pocket, but that's all you'll get if you get a Swift. And next up, moving around to the back of the Swift Boosterjet, where you will find a badge that says Swift Boosterjet, reminding everyone that you have a Swift Boosterjet. Anyway, opening up the tailgate back here and getting into the cargo area, the thing you will find back here is a bag. There's a bag that says Suzuki on it, and if you unzip this bag, you will find a set of jumper cables and also a road hazard warning triangle, which could be useful. The thing I like best about this bag, though, is the fact that it says on it Suzuki and then way of life. This apparently is Suzuki's motto in Mexico. Not a way of life, the way of life, just way of life. With an exclamation point. Now, it's worth noting that this bag is just Velcroed to the bottom of the cargo area, but it could be emptied and then you could take it with you like a piece of Suzuki luggage. Way of life. Other than the bag, it's not all that interesting in this cargo area. It's actually bigger than I was expecting, considering the size of a Mini Cooper, but with 4 doors. They do a pretty good job of packaging with this car, but it's a pretty standard, simple cargo area. And in fact, pretty standard and simple is kind of a theme with this car. In fact, if you leave the cargo area and you decide you want to lock your Swift, take a look at the key. It has a Suzuki logo on one side and lock and unlock buttons on the other side. There's no button to pop the tailgate, there's no button for the alarm, just what you need and nothing more. And to me, that's kind of a theme of this car. It's not crazy, it doesn't do anything insane or bizarre, but it gives you everything that you need, and well, that's about it. And so those are the quirks and features of the Swift Boosterjet. Now it's time to get it out on the road and see how it drives. All right, driving the Swift Boosterjet. Now, my initial impression of this car from reviewing it is that they do a really good job of making a good, cheap car. Just before you even drive it, they do a good job with everything that you want. Everything that you want is in here. You have a good infotainment system. You have good, gauge cluster. The seats are reasonably comfortable. The materials are decent, but it's not excessive. This car doesn't, in Mexican market, backup camera's not required. This car doesn't have one. And there are things like that. There's no xenon lights, blah, blah, blah. You can name a few things where costs are cut, but it's like, yeah, well, but I still have everything that I need. And when you're trying to get a car to hit a price point, that's a really key thing to determining what you should take out and what you should leave in. And I think they did a great job in this car. Yeah, it feels reasonably quick, especially for a little economy car. This is great. It's significantly better than any other little economy car that I've spent any time in recently. I was just in Thailand and I rented a Mitsubishi Mirage, which is truly one of the very worst cars, and that thing just feels lethargic by comparison. I mean, obviously this thing is no, sports car, and there is a sportier model called the Swift Sport with like 40 more horsepower, but this thing holds its own. It's pretty good. And it's got good passing power. I'm actually surprised. I start at 70 and I floor it, and that's really when economy cars tend to disappoint you. Even if they're good down low, they really usually can't do anything passing, but it does well. And again, that makes me feel sad that they didn't sell it here. I mean, yeah, it's not the fastest thing. It's not a Focus RS or even a Focus ST or even a Fiesta ST, but it's good enough, and it would, at the base end of the market, the low end of the market, this thing would just be so perfect. It would be better looking, better equipped, and more fun than so many cars that we do get instead. The Chevy Spark, even the little Ford Fiesta. I'm really surprised by road noise, which is very muted. Typically when you get in cars like this, they're loud, a lot of money is saved in cost cutting, and you do hear the tires a little bit more than you would want to, or more than you would in a more expensive car. But road noise generally is muted pretty well, and wind noise. Yeah, the steering is pretty good. There is a little bit of body roll, but the steering itself is more precise and more connected than I was expecting. The handling itself could be improved, it seems like, with stiffer suspension, but like I mentioned, there's the sport version of the Swift if you want to go even higher, and I suspect that's probably even a little bit more buttoned up than this one. The clutch and shifter are fine. The clutch feels good, I like that. The shifter is a little bit kind of vague and light. It's no Porsche. Everything works well too. You get in a cheap car that, regulations don't allow to be sold in North America, and you wonder, all right, what stuff can I find that's just not gonna work? And aside from the clocks being different times, this car is fine. It would totally have worked in North America, especially for $13,000. I mean, it just blows me away. And I think because of regulations in the States, we're not able to have this level of car for 13 grand, but 13 in the States buys you a Versa with no options. There's, the tiniest touchscreen just so they can have a camera in there. But there's no nav, there's no Apple CarPlay. I mean, it's incredible. And this thing does a great job of getting you everything you'd want, and it's kind of pokey. And so that's the Suzuki Swift Boosterjet. This car is probably too small for the American market, and profit margins on tiny cars are also really tiny themselves, so I understand why Suzuki left the North American market. It's just a shame they left right before they started making actually desirable cars like this one. Anyway, now it's time to give the Swift Boosterjet a Doug score.
Starting with the weekend categories and styling, the Swift looks really nice, one of the best small cars, and it gets a 6 out of 10. Acceleration is good for a subcompact, but still pretty slow overall, and it gets a 1 out of 10. Handling is nice, not as crisp as a true performance hatchback like a Fiesta ST, but it does well, and it gets a 4 out of 10. Fun factor is decent, it's reasonably peppy and pretty eager around curves, but it's no sports car, and it gets a 3 out of 10. Cool factor is also decent, it's cooler than other subcompacts, but of course that isn't saying much, and it gets a 3 out of 10 for a total weekend score of 17 out of 50. Next up are the daily categories and features. It has everything you need plus a few cool extras, and it gets a 5 out of 10. Comfort is normal for the class, and it gets a 5 out of 10. Quality is fine, nothing special, but a little nicer than average, and it gets a 6 out of 10. Practicality is only average. Most hatchbacks get a higher score, but this one is just too small. It's stuck with a 5 out of 10. Finally, value, and this one is really impressive. It's a reasonably fun little hatchback with good equipment, nice styling, and a nice interior for shockingly little money, and it gets a 7 out of 10 for a total daily score of 28 out of 50. Added up, and the Doug score is 45 out of 100, which places it here against some of the other small cars I've reviewed. I rarely review subcompact cars, but I think the Swift holds its own, and it's a shame Suzuki left the US market just before they started coming out with the good stuff.